Happy MLK Day today, everybody. January 20th. Oh my goodness. So I thought we'd just let these get together and talk about some things that are happening in the real estate business that have come across my desk lately. And we're going to talk about two things today. And that's pretty much all we're going to talk about today. Yeah, great day to sell. It's cold, man. Oh my gosh. My puppy was very frisky this morning. Let's just put it that way. Little Jimmy Buffett to start the morning. Thank you, Tracy. Cool. All right. So this question has come across my desk a lot lately, and it's really a difficult discussion because we've been so focused on charging appropriate commissions all the time, but that's really gone out the window now, right? So most importantly, what I want you guys to do is to get your 3% commission on the listing side, right? And I want you to fight hard for your 3% commission on the buyer side, right? So we're going to talk about how to do that today, because there's two addendums that you need to be familiar with. So let's say, hypothetically, I'm the listing agent, I'm getting my 3%, and the seller says, you know what, I'm going to play the game. I'm only going to offer a 1% commission. Okay, well, that works. We're not going to fight them. Yep. Okay, offer 1%. But I'm also going to warn the seller that, don't be surprised if the buyer's agent asks for more. Right? And then you have a decision to make. It's called negotiation. Right? So we're going to cover those two addendums today. One is the seller is not offering what you want to get, and you want to ask for more as a part of your offer. And the second one is going to be if the seller's agent did not play the game the right way and didn't give you an offer of compensation, you can make your offer subject to getting paid. Either way, I think you're all going to get a raise as a result of these changes that are happening now. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to jump into that. Screen one is where I'm at. Okay, this is my favorite one. So just take it for what it is. Credit related to buyer broker compensation. So we're going to ask the seller to credit us as a result of our buyer broker agreement. So when you are, and I hope you guys are doing this, when you're getting a buyer broker agreement, because whenever you work with a buyer, you have to have an agreement, right? And the buyer says, yep, I'll pay you 3% as long as the seller pays it. Works for me. And so they're fine. So this agreement says the buyer has entered into a separate brokerage agreement, as may be amended, which is not incorporated herein by this reference with Century 21 Beggins. At closing, seller agrees to credit buyer the sums described below, for which disclosure purposes only the parties agree is related to buyer's obligation under buyer broker agreement to pay all or a portion of buyer's compensation. Okay, so let that sink in for a second. So you have a BBA with your buyer saying 3%. You find out the seller's only offering 1%. So this is the addendum you want to use to request that the seller pay you the extra 2% that your buyer is obligated to pay you, right? So you have three options. Check here, the percent of the purchase price, here a dollar amount, or here a purchase price plus, and that's what we're going to use because we want our, let's say they're offering 1 and you want 3, and your buyer broker agreement allows you to accept 3, then you would ask for 2% of the purchase price plus our transaction fee, right? So we'll check here. I won't let me do it because I'm not in the loop actually, but that's what you would do. You would check here. I want 2% to make up the difference from what my buyer is obligated to pay me because of my BBA. And then our transaction fee would be here. So that's the one you would fill out. In the event the credit described above exceeds the amount allowed by the buyer's lender for such contributions, then the extent permitted by buyer's lender can check 1. If no box is checked, the balance should be paid by the seller directly to the buyer broker, or 2, balance of the credit will be paid by seller directly to the buyer broker, or the credit will be reduced to the maximum amount allowed by buyer's lender. This is where it gets a little more complicated because you're only allowed to collect what your BBA says, right? And I'm not saying you have to always get your 3, but you can always ask for your 3, right? And then if it does kick in that the lender is not allowed to pay that much, Dixie, stop it. She has decided to chew her bed, just so you know. That's where we get into a little bit of confusion, right? But let's say the seller's offering 1, your buyer broker allows you to collect 3, you're allowed to ask for the extra 2 in this addendum FF. Now, if your BBA says 2, then you can't ask for 2 in addition to the seller's 1, because that would be more than you're allowed to collect. So it's really important to me that you guys are asking for 3% on everything. We always have the ability to reduce it because it says as may be amended by this agreement, right? So why not ask for 3 on everything that you get? Questions? 2 questions in the chat. We could be in the really frozen north instead of the relatively balmy Florida paradise. Yeah, relatively balmy. My computer says 47 degrees outside. That's not relatively balmy in my world. Cold and rainy in the Keys. So we're going to see all that today. Cool. All right. So does that make sense? So it really doesn't matter how much the seller is offering because you're going to use this addendum to collect as much as you're allowed to collect because of your BBA, right? So when you are negotiating with your buyer, most of you are getting 3% BBAs, so you're allowed to ask, and this is what that addendum is for. And I've talked to like 3 or 4 people this weekend that are still confused over this point, right? And Chris Reed and I were discussing the other day, should we even be fighting to offer more compensation for the buyer's agent? Doesn't matter. Make it part of the negotiation. What if the seller is offering 3% and the buyer broker agreement only allows for 2? Then the seller can only pay 2 because the buyer broker agreement limits them to that. The buyer can't collect more than their buyer broker agreement. So maybe it's not even worth us fighting. So, hey, just pay me, seller, my 3% and what would you like to offer the buyer broker? I think it's prudent to offer 3%, but if you don't want to, you don't have to. Just understand they're probably going to ask for it anyway and be willing to pay it. So let's talk about that part of the negotiation for a second. So you are the listing broker. The buyer's broker turns in a contract on your listing and they have addendum FF and they're asking for the seller to pay a percentage of the purchase price toward their obligation to pay the buyer broker, right? This is where you get to think about reducing it to negotiation and numbers. So let's say it's a $500,000 house and they're asking for an extra 2%, which would be what? $10,000. So seller, your offer is $500,000, which is your asking price, but this buyer is asking for 2%, $10,000 in closing costs. It's really no different than the buyer asking for a closing cost concession because this is part of the buyer's closing costs. So it's really not a $500,000 offer anymore. It's a $490,000 offer. So what can you do with that as a listing agent? You can accept it and say, okay, it's really a $490 offer. We'll take it. Could you also counter offer and say, you know what? We'll pay your 2%, but we're going to raise the price to $505 or $510. Or does the seller not want to risk it and just take the $10,000 off and be happy with the contract? I think part of it is our negotiation point from the beginning. Seller, what would you like to offer? You don't have to offer anything if you don't want to, but offer something. And understand the buyer broker may ask for something else. It'll be a condition of the offer. And then you could always counter the offer and raise the price. So I think that's the point I want to get across today, is that we are negotiating now for our value. All right. So as a listing broker, we are pretty much getting our 3% across the board, which is a raise for all of you and us. right? And then as a buyer broker, we got to fight for it if the seller's not offering it. And how do you fight for it? With this addendum right here called FF. Okay. So that being said, let's say, and this is happening also, let's see. Is it bad that I don't even ask for the listing agent's compensation um, on the deal sheet per terms of the compensation agreement, what's being offered, rather than 3% on the buyer broker side? And I've been reminding them if they don't intend to charge the difference, we need the BBA amended. Okay, let me think this through. This is why it's coming up, Amy. Doing a deal with a Keller Williams agent now, and this agent knows nothing about Addendum FF, right? Most agents are not getting a kickback on their offer, on their 3% when the buyer's offer is solid, right? Solid offer, accept it. Okay, Sam says, I have agents filling in compensation on the deal sheet for the terms of the compensation agreement, what's being offered. Yeah, that's the challenge I wanted to get through. FF is designed to make up the difference, the credit between what the seller is offering and what your buyer is obligated to pay. So take it for face value. FF says credit related to buyer broker's compensation. So if the seller's offering 1, then in your BBA says 3, you're going to ask the seller to credit you the extra 2. So that's the number you're going to put in here, not the full amount. And so it's come up. This is one of the issues I had this weekend. If they put in 3% here and the seller's already offering 1 or 2, then you can't collect 5 because your BBA limits you to what you're allowed to accept, right? So this FF is designed to give you the difference between what the seller is offering, and that entails that you know what the seller is offering. And I understand that there's people in the marketplace that are not sharing that information. So in that case, we're going to go to another addendum, right? So this is if you know what the seller is offering and it doesn't meet what your BBA says your buyer is obligated to pay you, you would use this to get a credit from the seller to make up the difference between what the buyer owes you or is supposed to owe you. And if you can't get it, then you negotiate. And if not, we can make a decision at that point. Okay. So that's FF, right? Now we've got to go look at GG. So I'm going to share my screen again. And this is in the case where the listing agent did not tell you how much commission the seller is offering. And you've got a BBA because you're a good agent and you follow the rules, right? And that's important because you're not allowed to work with a buyer unless you have a BBA. So if you do that, then you've got an agreement that your buyer is going to pay you X, but you want the seller to pay you. So that's where addendum GG comes in. It says seller's agreement with respect to buyer broker compensation, right? And this has now been amended into FAR 7, and you've got FF and GG now as checkboxes in your addendum section, all right? And this is what's really cool about this one, because we never had this before. This contract is contingent upon seller's broker and buyer's broker, or seller and buyer's broker. Very interesting. Executing a compensation agreement with the terms acceptable to buyer, a compensation agreement within blank days, if left blank 3 days. If the compensation agreement described herein is not executed and delivered within the time frame, then buyer may, within 3 days thereafter, deliver written notice to the seller terminating the contract, in which event the deposit shall be refunded to the buyer, thereby releasing buyer and seller from all further obligations. If buyer fails to timely deliver said written notice to seller, this contingency shall have no further force or effect. All right, so I don't know how much compensation the seller is asking for. So I'm going to make, and this goes back to my old days, right? So go back to pre-August 17th of 2024, where a lot of times people were writing into the contract, you know, this is subject to the seller paying the buyer's compensation. Okay, that was fine. but it doesn't hold up because theoretically the seller were to strike that clause, you would have to present that offer back to the buyer, and then the buyer would have to say, sorry, Craig, you're not going to get your 30%. I'm going to take this deal. But now that's making the offer subject to the seller paying it, right? Because the buyer has an obligation to pay you because of your BVA. Okay. So that's kind of the difference between these two documents. One is the seller is offering something, but you want more. That's FF. Two, you don't know what the seller is offering. So you want to make your offer subject to the seller paying you what the buyer has been obligated to pay you based on your BBA. So that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about today. I do have some notes here, though. All right, chats again. I hate being an extremist here, but Rachel says, I'm with you, John. If listing agents are too stupid to share their agreements, then we go straight for it. Makes more paperwork, but it also makes my offer um, crystal clear in the mind of the other agent and the seller, because as Sam pointed out, then we have to adjust depending on where it's coming from. Chris says FS is also a way, FF is also a way for us, for the buyer and seller to negotiate the compensation, since it's a credit from the seller to the buyer in regards to buyer broker compensation. Or if they're not offering anything, use FF. Yeah. That's why I want you guys to understand the difference between the two. Amy says the Keller Williams agent said strike through it. No, that's not the right way to do it. Ooh, that's a good one. Agents don't understand FF as a gap coverage. If an agent does not provide an offering of compensation, can we just, sorry, it's moving around on me. Can we just use that as our compensation addendum if the seller prefers to give a credit than compensation? Yeah, either one works. Yeah, and Rachel, this is why we're talking about it today. So she's sorry, just about every question I've dealt with about contracts lately has to do with other agents not wanting to share what their seller is offering until they have the signed contract. Okay. And, a lot of agents are out there, and let's talk about that too. A lot of agents are not getting 3% BBAs, so they're only allowed to collect two. But if they find out in advance that the seller is offering three, they can go back to the seller or to their buyer and get an amended BBA and ask for three. So that's kind of the rationale between an agent not wanting to share what they're offering. Yes, it's very exhausting educating the other agents in the marketplace. That's why I want you to have a very good understanding. Yeah, if the listing agent would share, you've got a BBA that says you get three, make it a condition of your offer. That's what GG is for, right? FF is for if the seller is making an offer and you want to make up the difference, the gap, if you will. Yes, Lauren, we're going to see that happening. People leaving the industry. As a matter of fact, I'm going to share my training screen real quick. And where did I put it? I downloaded some slides that Brian Buffini did on a class I took this weekend. I think it was this one probably. No, Kathleen didn't cover this last week. I don't know. They're not here right now. All right. Are you guys feeling more comfortable now with FF and GG? I think it's a good thing for all of us to know what the differences are. And yes, you have to educate the other people. And it's so simple, right? Because your offer of compensation is what your buyer is willing to pay you. and the buyer can ask the seller to pay their closing costs because it becomes a buyer's closing cost. So it's just like asking for closing costs, but you got to be careful on how much you ask for because the lender may only allow a certain amount. Correct. Can't hurt to have refreshers. Very cool. Well, that's all we're going to talk about today. I said those two things on my list. It is a holiday, federal holiday. There's no trash, and it's inauguration day. So enjoy the coolness while it's here and stay dry. Yep, I'm going to check my notes here. Oh, I do want to remind you that Joe Diener has done a really nice job creating a condo rider checklist. So when you go through and you're getting a listing, it's really imperative now that the seller does their due diligence and get their condo stuff together. And we do sell a lot of condominiums. So a seller has to do that. So look in your dot loop to make sure you find the condo rider checklist and say, here, seller, this is what you need to go get. And then I want to put all that on the MLS as an attachment. Okay, cool. That's it. Short and sweet. Happy Monday. Happy MLK Day. And we'll see you for sales meeting tomorrow. Thank you much.